Las Karen Corla and deputies. In many ways, over the last 2 decades, waste policy has been Ireland's unsung environmental success story. We have progressed from a situation where the state was facing prosecution before the European courts for lack of enforcement of unlicensed landfills, to one where we have both radically reduced our dependence on landfill, and our enforcement programme against unlicensed activity has been hailed by the European Commission as a model of best practice for resolving large-scale waste infringements. However, that is the past, and we must look to the future, where we will have to meet increasingly ambitious European targets for recycling and reuse, where we must reduce our dependency on the vagaries of international markets for waste export, and where we fully embrace social, economic and environmental opportunities of a circular economy. And more fundamentally, we must meet the challenge of a future where we cannot continue to rely on complex global supply chains to the extent that we do today, where all countries will be faced by the reality of increased competition for raw materials, and where the pace of primary resource extraction is far outstripping the planet's capacity to meet our needs in the long term. The foundations of the linear economy, based around a take-make-waste model, are creaking at the seams. Embracing a regenerative circular economy where waste is minimised, where economic growth is decoupled from resource consumption, and where the value of goods and materials is retained in our economy for as long as possible, is an environmental, economic and strategic necessity for Ireland. This bill sets out a comprehensive suite of regulatory, policy and economic measures which, taken together, will help us to embrace the opportunities of a future defined by this circular transition. The bill will provide the necessary legislative basis to place several key measures, including the Circular Economy Strategy, the Circular Economy Programme and the National Food Waste Prevention Programme on a statutory footing. The adoption in December of last year of a high-level, whole-of-government circular economy strategy plays a fundamental role and provides an overarching policy framework that works for the public, private and for the voluntary sectors. The first version of that strategy, which was published in December, sets out the first high-level steps we need to take to make the transition possible. The first version of the strategy is by design a high-level document which aims to communicate government's overall approach to the circular economy, but subsequent iterations will feature increasingly detailed and ambitious targets. The bill provides that the statutory version of the strategy may feature both economy-wide and sectoral targets, and it sets out the supporting actions necessary to achieve those targets. Following enactment of the bill, I intend to commence work on the second, more action-oriented version of the strategy, which will then be on a statutory basis as a priority this year. The Circular Economy Programme was also launched in December, and it is being implemented by the Environmental Protection Agency. It will provide critical, evidence-led support to achieving our national policy objectives. The new programme builds on and encompasses the agency's previous National Waste Prevention Programme, which has been integral to our national success in relation to waste policy outcomes, adding new elements and a new focus specifically related to supporting the circular economy. The bill provides that these new elements will have the same statutory basis as the programme's pre-existing waste prevention measures, which are currently provided for in the Waste Management Act. Food waste is a global problem that has environmental, social and economic consequences. Worldwide, more than 1/4 of food that is produced is wasted. A public consultation on Ireland's first draft National Food Waste Prevention Roadmap was launched by my department in January of this year, and it will conclude this week. The roadmap will set out a series of actions to ultimately achieve the government's ambition to halve Ireland's food waste by 2030. Key areas of focus in the draft roadmap include establishing Ireland's baseline data on food waste, from which we will set out to achieve a 50% reduction by 2030, and this 50% target derives from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Placing the strategy, programme and roadmap on a statutory footing will ensure that the circular economy transition remains a national policy priority. The bill will also give the Minister for the Environment, Climate and Communications the power to introduce new environmental levies on single-use items and in due course to prohibit the placing on the market of certain environmentally harmful products, replacing and building on existing powers currently set out in waste legislation. The new levies will work in a similar way to the plastic bag levy, with the proceeds ring-fenced in a circular economy fund for projects relating to environmental and climate action objectives. The various levies will be introduced incrementally, However, the initial focus will be the introduction of levies on disposable hot drinks cups. Levies and bans will only be introduced where more sustainable alternatives are readily available to the consumer. They will not be applied to any product which remains necessary for reasons of food safety or to prevent food wastage. The objective of the new levies is not to raise revenue. Indeed, the aim of introducing them is to encourage the use of reusable alternatives so that the consumer never incurs the levy in the first place. The precise details regarding scope and rate of the levy on disposable coffee cups will be set out in secondary legislation following enactment of the bill, with the intention of bringing the levy into force as early as possible. The new levies will build on Ireland's successful experience of the plastic bag levy and the landfill levy. I look forward to introducing the levy on disposable coffee cups as soon as possible this year, and I expect to see a rapid and significant surge in the use of reusable cups and a decline in coffee cup litter across the country. I believe that the use of economic instruments to incentivise sustainable behaviour can work, because we've seen it work with plastic bags and with landfill. And I'm also firmly of the view that if levies are carefully applied on the basis of a strong evidence base, then they will produce more sustainable consumption patterns and will not result in increased costs to businesses and consumers. Businesses should, after all, be able to achieve savings due to the reduced need to stock disposable items such as single-use coffee cups. And where those businesses pass those savings on, and I hope they will, to customers who avail of reusable products, then the consumer also benefits. In addition, if we can successfully embed reusable items in our daily habits, then that provides opportunities for new business models based around activities such as deposit return schemes and reverse logistics. To support this development and to further reduce any costs associated with the levy on consumers and businesses, I intend to specifically target a portion of the income for the new environmental levies towards projects and schemes which will increase the availability of reusable products and packaging. Recognising the role played by the Environment Fund since its inception and the need to align its objectives more closely with the promotion of the circular economy, the Environment Fund will be replaced by a new Circular Economy Fund under the bill. This fund will continue to support key environmental projects in the coming years. The bill will also make important amendments to the Waste Management Act to support the delivery of further actions in the Waste Action Plan. And in the context of waste enforcement, the bill will advance a number of priority provisions, including the use of technologies such as CCTV for waste enforcement purposes, in a way that is fully in compliance with national and EU data protection law. Littering and dumping defaces both our rural and urban landscapes. It is a serious threat to our environment, and in terms of both enforcement and clean-up, it results in significant costs for local authorities. At a local level, I think we're all aware from our constituency work how much littering and dumping can affect our local communities. It's also an issue which causes huge upset for citizens, spoiling local beauty spots and often undoing the invaluable work that's undertaken by our Tidy Towns groups, our committees and volunteers. A combination of legislation, guidance and the use of mandatory codes of practice provided for in the bill will ensure that the processing of personal data may be carried out by local authorities tasked with enforcing litter and waste law. This will provide an important deterrent to protect our environment from the scourge of littering and illegal dumping, while at the same time respecting the privacy rights of citizens. I'm very aware that there will be concerns regarding data privacy in light of these new powers, and I want to assure deputies these concerns have been to the fore in drafting the relevant sections of the bill. Local authorities will only be able to use these new powers in relation to waste enforcement and littering. The bill prevents any possibility of mission creep in that regard. Local authorities will need to address whether the use of CCTV and other technologies are necessary and proportionate in relation to the specific issues that they wish to tackle, and they will be required to carry out regular reviews of their use of these technologies to ensure that they remain necessary and proportionate. No deployment of these technologies will be permitted until the relevant code of practice is in place. These codes, which will set out in detail the operational requirements for minimising data intrusion, will be subject to ministerial approval. The bill also explicitly prohibits the use of automated number plate recognition and automatic facial recognition for waste enforcement and anti-littering purposes, because having consulted with both the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner and local government sector, I don't believe that either of these technologies are necessary or proportionate for the purposes of the bill. My department has very much welcomed the involvement of the Data Protection Commissioner in the development of these provisions, and I fully expect that this cooperation will continue in the context of the development of codes of practice. This will support an ongoing effort by local authorities to tackle illegal dumping and littering. Provision will also be made for the use of fixed penalty notices for additional waste streams, including under the extended producer responsibility model for dealing with waste tyres. The changes proposed have the general aim of providing for more proportionate and more focused enforcement. A combination of legislation, guidance and the use of mandatory codes of practice will ensure that the processing of personal data may be carried out by local authorities tasked with enforcing litter and waste law, thus providing an important deterrent in order to protect our environment from the scourge of littering and illegal dumping, while at the same time respecting the privacy rights of our citizens. Further provisions of the bill will help drive better segregation of waste in the commercial sector. EPA statistics indicate that 70% of the material placed in the general waste bins should be in recycling or organic bins, and this in turn will help us to achieve our EU targets for recycling and landfill. Again, my expectation is that providing for better segregation of commercial waste, with recyclable material separated from general waste in the same manner which currently applies to households, will ultimately save businesses money through lower collection costs. The bill also provides for powers to include additional requirements in the permits held by waste collectors. In tandem with the new environmental levies, the bill provides for the introduction of a new waste recovery levy. This will apply to waste sent for recovery, that is, for incineration or for landfill backfilling, here in Ireland or exported abroad for those purposes. This new recovery levy will complement the existing landfill levy and will further improve the relative economic incentives for waste holders to choose recycling or reuse over other disposal methods. In common with the landfill levy, revenue from the waste recovery levy will be ring-fenced in the new Circular Economy Fund. The bill will help streamline and improve the end-of-waste and byproduct application processes that are currently administered by the EPA. These two regulatory processes provide a means whereby material that would otherwise be disposed of as waste can be safely reused, for example, in the form of secondary raw materials. This could be particularly significant for our construction sector, providing more options in terms of recycled materials and reducing the sector's material footprint. The measures proposed in the bill will help drive higher quality applications, and ultimately they will tailor the level of regulatory scrutiny of applications relative to their environmental risk. Finally, the bill will end the issuing of new licences for the exploration and mining of coal, lignite and oil shale. This will consolidate our policy of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. So, in conclusion, this bill marks a watershed moment in Ireland in how Ireland will address its resources needs in the coming decades. The measures proposed are ambitious, but they're also considered. The circular economy, if it is to be successful, must work for everyone. It must provide opportunities and it must reduce costs for consumers at the same time as it reduces the environmental impact of our consumption and production patterns. The powers provided for have been subject in most cases to extensive consultations with stakeholders, either directly as the bill has been drafted or through other processes. And in this regard, I'd like to thank the Joint Oireachtas Committee for their contributions under the pre-legislative scrutiny process, and I will address how I will be responding to the Committee's recommendations in my closing remarks. Thank you, Lasceann Corlin. Thank you, Deputies.
Sinn Féin. 10 minutes.
Lasceann Corlin. Today's globalised economy is overwhelmingly based on a linear model of production and consumption. We take, make and then waste. The environmental impacts of a linear throwaway model in which we extract great quantities of natural resources to make things that we may only use once before disposing of them is not sustainable. It's estimated that the raw materials resources which we use in a year is already 50% more than nature can replenish in a year, and this will rise to a factor of 3 by 2050 on present trends. The circular economy offers an alternative whereby waste and resource use is minimised and the value of products and materials is maintained for as long as possible. Getting items repaired instead of binning them and remanufacturing items by taking them apart and using parts again in new items has the potential to decrease the amount of primary resource extraction and reduce the carbon impact of manufacturing and transporting single-use items. We need to start thinking and acting in new ways. Our planet simply demands it. As a result, Sinn Féin welcome most aspects of this bill. What's unusual about the bill is that the circular economy isn't pioneering or anything new. Actually, it tries to recreate what happened in days gone by. Years ago, very little food was thrown away in homes. People mended the soles of their shoes, sewed torn clothes, passed them down and repaired broken household items. Modern-day consumerism has fuelled a damaging throwaway approach, resulting in huge, almost unimaginable amounts of waste, something this bill and national strategy now seek to reverse. I make a number of points. In terms of responsibility, all the responsibility cannot be placed at the feet of workers and families to change this approach. Corporations who have profited hugely from this throwaway model need to be tackled and forced to take appropriate action to change their behaviour. Last year, I travelled to COP26 in Glasgow and highlighted at that time the irony of the CEO of Amazon speaking at a major climate change conference, when just weeks earlier, a few miles up the road from Glasgow, the company he heads was found to be destroying millions of items of unsold stock every year, including smart TVs, laptops, drones and hairdryers, simply to ensure the excess didn't impact on their profits. It was a disgusting display of greed and waste. So while disposable cups might be the headline for the media today, there's no point charging consumers for using a coffee cup if such disgraceful behaviour by major corporations is not challenged and addressed by government and regulators. This bill seeks to give the Minister the power to introduce new environmental levies on single-use items and, in the longer term, to prohibit the placing on the market of certain environmentally harmful products. 91% of all plastics are single-use, and the rate of mass production since plastic became commonly used almost 6 decades ago has resulted in 8.3 billion metric tonnes of plastic pollution. 8.3 billion metric tonnes. Single-use plastics are a scourge on our environment, with a vast amount ending up in our oceans and impacting hugely on our marine ecosystems. It was amazing to see the speed at which industry could abandon some single-use plastics and move to a more sustainable model when they had to under the EU single-use plastic directives which came into force last year. It's a shame it took so long to address this, in addition to microplastics, with so much of it ending up in landfill and our oceans. The officials from your department, Minister, raised the prospect of applying a levy on all classes of coffee cup, for example, both plastic and biodegradable, to discourage the single-use approach and promote reusable alternatives. I might ask the Minister for an update on what approach he now intends to take in this area. As the Minister will be aware, at the beginning of this year, France banned the sale of certain fruit and vegetables that came wrapped in unnecessary plastic. Walk down the fruit and vegetable aisle of any supermarket here in Ireland and the amount of needless plastic wrapping on some foods is astonishing. Such a ban is not included in this bill. I previously asked the Minister via parliamentary question if he intended to follow suit, take the French example, and he indicated he wasn't planning to introduce a similar ban here, as our supply chain is different to that of France and such a proposal would need to be examined further. I would ask the Minister if further consideration has been given to this. I think it's quite incredible. You look at the amount of plastic wrapping and a plastic sticker on every individual apple or orange or whatever it might be. On a related matter, one of the topics that my colleague Senator Lynn Boylan raised at PLS was the standards of biodegradable packaging and the importance of ensuring we simply don't replace single-use plastics with single-use biodegradable containers that are questionable in terms of their content, for example with PFAS. The environmental charity Voice Ireland gave evidence at PLS that a compostable bowl they obtained here, actually in the Dáil canteen, was the highest rated for PFAS, with 12 times the allowable amount of that chemical coating on the bowl. These chemicals touch people's food, and when the container is composted, can end up back in a farmer's field and in the the food chain again. Denmark and California recently both banned PFAS in food contact material, and I wonder if the Minister has given consideration to this. On the National Food Waste Prevention Strategy, I welcome the proposal contained in the bill to draft a National Food Waste Prevention Strategy. Despite the horrendous level of world hunger, more than 1/4 of food produced worldwide is wasted. In Ireland, I think people have become more conscientious of food waste in recent years, and the arrival of food waste prevention apps, which allow people to buy excess food from shops and bakeries for discount, highlights the positive role technology can play in fighting food waste. At PLS, I raised the issue of the need for mandatory reporting by food businesses of the amount of food waste they generate and the actions taken to reduce such waste. Under the provisions of the bill and strategy, we have to reduce food waste by 50% by 2030. It's argued that a mandatory 7% food waste reduction target should be set each year, with appropriate enforcement mechanisms to ensure we can meet this target. Again, I'd ask the Minister if he would outline what consideration is given to that mandatory approach. On the deposit return scheme, while the details of the proposed scheme are not included in the bill, it does form a key part of the circular economy approach. Regulations were signed by the Minister last year for a DRS for plastic bottles and aluminium cans, and that's supposed to come into effect later on this year. While this is welcome and long overdue, Sinn Féin is strongly of the opinion that glass should be included in any new scheme. A recommendation from PLS noted similarly, as glass is an acceptable material for deposit return and for the development of collection, cleaning and refilling infrastructure, consideration should be given to including glass containers in any future expansion of DRS, and maybe that's something you might, Minister, touch on in your closing remarks. On CCTV and drone use, we welcome the new provisions that will allow local authorities to use CCTV and drones in a proportional manner to combat illegal dumping. It is an absolute scourge. I wanted to raise some questions in terms of your engagement with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. I expect we'll have opportunity at committee stage to tease out those details, because it's, there is a fine line and it's important to get the balance right in terms of this technology and how it's used, and that's something that will require close scrutiny. In terms of the Circular Economy Fund, Minister, I would just ask if you could outline how much is in the fund, in the Environment Fund, what's the estimated annual income of the new circular economy, and the details of what activities will be financed by that new fund. To touch on a further point that was raised at PLS in relation to repair shops, we heard from various witnesses who had the experience of trying to do their very best with repair shops, but raised, for example, the barriers, the hurdles, the impediments that they faced, and one that they touched on was the issue of VAT and insurance. So I might ask the Minister to give some indication if he is engaged with the Minister for Finance on these matters. We welcome the bill. There's a huge amount in it, Minister. I think an important point in relation to it will be how it impacts on the worst offenders, on businesses, on corporations. It can't just be left to individuals, but we'll be happy to work with yourself, and I know you've taken a significant personal interest and responsibility in relation to bringing the bill forward, so I look forward to working with you in at committee stage and further stages.
Deputy Cronin.
The Circular Economy Bill might sound remote to people who are struggling with the cost of living at the moment, but actually it matters in how we live our lives in the context of waste, emissions and climate change. I'm pleased to support this bill, but overall, while I support it, it is important that we put it into the context of where we are in terms of consumption, waste and the climate crisis. Anyone with friends or family in New South Wales in Australia know that they woke to yet more deluges of rain, with the levees on the point of collapsing and sirens wailing. Here at home we have seen hurricanes, force winds creeping up the North Atlantic, with storms racing through the letters of the alphabet. We read reports warning of the effects of rising oceans on our cities, including Dublin, where our Dáil sits. We have watched climate scientists scratch their heads at the simultaneous heat waves in the North and South Poles, and really, as politicians, in this generation of politicians, they should be the only poles that we're really worried about, because we are the politicians who are going to have to mitigate as best we can the impacts of climate change and the excess consumption of our generation, our children and their children. It has gone too far for prevention at this stage, and we really are now in mitigation mode. In the 40s and the 50s, our people in Ireland used to suffer and die from TB, or consumption as it was called at the time. But in this generation, where it's another kind of consumption that is killing us and is also killing our planet. And we, as politicians, have to be straight with people. As I've been saying repeatedly at the Climate Committee, what government anywhere is telling their people that they actually need to consume less stuff and use less energy, given the depth and the breadth of the crisis that we are facing. Given the abrupt climate change we are seeing, with parts of Europe collapsing in landslides, Canada and California going up in flames, islands in Greece being evacuated, and parts of Australia going underwater, with herds of cattle being swept away by floods. I don't agree with our own government that puts too much onus on the individual, as opposed to leading from the front and demanding institutional change on climate. 2 years ago, and before the rapid ice melt, came the urgent warnings from Oxfam that the carbon emissions of the richest 1% were more than double the emissions of half of humanity. That's over 3 billion people. So we have serious work to do on serious matters affecting our children and theirs as they live the worst effects of destructive capitalism and all its exploitation and all its manipulation and all its empty promises. On this bill, Sinn Féin will be bringing forward our own amendments where appropriate at committee stage. The latte levy on a cup, it might sound catchy, but it refers to the single-use model that is wholly unsustainable because we are running when we shouldn't even be standing or replenishing. Already we use 50% in a year that nature can make up, and that will treble by 2050 based on current trends. What way is that to live? What example is that to give to up-and-coming generations? What we see in abrupt climate change, how can any continuance of the consumption be justified? And we're obsessed with growth in this country. We really have to look at that. The drafting of a waste food strategy provided for by the bill is essential. It is unconscionable that while half of our world is dumping food, most of the other half are starving. Look at Yemen, and I'll admit it's really, really hard to look at the famine that's destroying Yemen and watching little babies and little children's arms being measured, and they're only as wide as our thumbs. But while the starvation there starts with its people being starved, the conflict that is also starved of international attention too, in the appeasement of Saudi Arabia by our own government, a government that has rained bombs on innocents, and God knows the untold carbon emissions that come from those, engages in mass decapitations, butchers, and I mean actually butchers a journalist in one of its embassies. It's absolutely disgraceful. The regime is also as polluting and devastating as the fossil fuels wreaking havoc on our planet, on biodiversity and on our people. But having a poor effect on society is the disposable income, where cheaper items tend to be of lower quality, requiring frequent replacement. And the inbuilt obsolescence is going to have to go. The right to repair is essential, and we must have better quality goods available at a good price, so those on low incomes are not locked out of the circular economy. My nana wasn't wrong when she told us that we should save for the good thing because it'll last. And if you can afford it, it's very good advice. But again, it's lower paid families are affected by that because they can't afford to buy the expensive item. We have to look forward to the return of the local repair shops that is such a common sight in our neighbouring countries in Europe. Like we see, there's a haberdashery stores in every town and village. Here you can repair your vacuum cleaner or your lawnmower or your TV. or even often Maynooth, my own hometown, we still have a Gracie, so we go there to get our boots and heels and soled. So while I broadly welcome the bill, as a member of the Climate Committee, I do look forward to bringing forward other amendments, and I hope you look on them favourably.
Deputy Kelly, you're gaining a minute.
Minister, the idea of the circular economy and waste management is something that's certainly not new to most people that live in rural Ireland and grew up in rural Ireland. My father worked all his life fixing farm machinery. My brother had a scrapyard, basically, where took in old beaten down cars, and everyone that had an old banger that wanted to keep it going came, and when the radiator burst, they got a radiator off him or the whatever, and all of the materials of the car was sent off to be recycled. He now leases that out and doesn't do that business anymore. But the concept of all of that is something that most people, I think, will embrace and would want to do. But in the last couple of weeks, and I was just thinking about this, the fridge in our house started to make a lot of noise. And it was, when I pulled it out and looked underneath, there was a little fan that runs beside the cooler, and the little fan is a little plastic, and one of the things was broken off it, and it was tipping away. I went on spares.ie, couldn't be got. I went on all the various websites, rang somebody who was a repairman. He said, that fridge is about 10 years old, you won't get a fan for it. Just a little piece of plastic. I'd say it wouldn't cost 10 cents to make, but the fact that it's broken, now, it's still working and it's a bit noisy, but anyway, we'll put up with it for another while. But the point is that the companies that manufacture goods and sell them to us have a responsibility also, I believe, to manufacture the spare parts, not just for the time that they want, so that you have to buy a new one, but as it moves on into the future. And I think that's one of the points that we should be making sure that we put in place. And, you know, others have talked about the role of corporate and corporate sector in all of this. And I think that's the key role in all of it. And while, as we know, you know, disposable cups and all of those things are a problem, but really the big place where all of this waste happens is in the corporate sector. The big place where all of it happens is when the corporations decide, you know, that particular model of whatever it is, we're going to cast that one side and we're going to come out with this new one. And you know, everyone believes that a washing machine is supposed to last about 4 or 5 years. And then you throw it out and you get a new one. You know, and I seen the same with our washing machine a number of years ago. The bearing went in, it started to make noise. You think there was an aeroplane taking off. Went and talked to the repair guy. Can't get them anymore. You have to get the entire drum. The entire drum is as dear as a new washing machine. So what do? You throw it out. And we have that going on all the time. So I think it's not just, in fairness, it's not just an Irish problem. It's a global problem, and I think it needs to be recognised as that. That as materials like that are being dealt with, that we have to have a way of making sure that the corporate sector does it in a means that it is fixable and that people are trained into fixing them, and that we have an economy around that which is separate from the other economy, which is about the cast away and start again. On the other issues which are mentioned in the bill, and one of them I was glad to see at the back of the bill is the last piece in regard to coal mining and basically hydraulic fracking. I think is really what the fossil fuels and the gases from tight sands and all of that. You know, we had a big campaign in our part of the world, in Leitrim and West Cavan and all that area, about hydraulic fracking and about extracting gas in that way and how bad it can be for the environment. But, Minister, I put it to you that it's equally, if it's bad for us to do it here in Ireland, it's bad to be taking gas from anywhere else that's doing the same thing. And I think that's the point that I think has to be made, and we have to recognise that we are a global economy, not just an economy, but a global ecology, that if something is bad here, it's bad in Pennsylvania, or it's bad somewhere else, and we should not be buying into it, and should not be, because of situations in Ukraine or situations of shortages of oil or anything else, we shouldn't be allowing those temporary problems, as extreme and horrible as they are temporary problems. We should not put ourselves into a position that we cannot have our economy held to ransom in respect of that. So I take it that, you know, while there's amendments to be made, and I believe there's improvements to be made in the legislation to bring forward here, at the same time, it's moving in the right direction, but there's a great deal more work to be done.
Good last Ceann Comhairle, and I welcome the opportunity to debate the Circular Economy Bill today, and indeed I welcome it on behalf of Labour, and we're glad to support it. As you've said, Minister, the bill aims to shift Ireland's consumption patterns from a take, make, waste linear model to the more sustainable pattern of production and consumption that would have an aim of reducing and minimising waste and thereby reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a very welcome move to do this. In a circular economy, as we know, waste and resource use are minimised and the use and value of products and materials is maintained for as long as possible, so that when a product reaches the end of its life, its parts are used again and again to create further useful and productive products instead of being discarded, an all too familiar pattern that we've just been hearing about now. It's hard for many of us, I think, to fathom the quantity of waste that is produced worldwide. And indeed, I think most of us don't like to think about waste. I think it's naturally, it's a distasteful concept even to reflect on the amount of waste we in our own households produce, and it's non-productive producing of waste, and it's hard to visualise it. It's not something we like to think about or to talk about. It's out of sight, out of mind in many cases, but clearly we need to address this issue of waste. It was brought into my attention very graphically on a recent visit I made to the Covanta waste incinerator plant in my own constituency in the Poolbeg Peninsula, and to be confronted with literally a mountain of human-produced waste, a lot domestic, also corporate. That is a wake-up call, I think, it's an experience that is quite has quite a profound effect to be confronted with the visible manifestation of our waste and our wasteful habits. So I do very much welcome this bill because it seeks to tackle that issue that for all too often we don't like to think about or talk about or even debate in political circles. I want to speak about different aspects of the bill that I welcome. First, the use of CCTV, and in respect of Section 20 of the bill, I welcome the introduction of measures to detect and deter illegal dumping and littering by empowering of local authorities to use GDPR compliant technologies to detect and prevent unsightly and illegal dumping and littering, among other measures. So we in Labour support this measure, first proposed by my colleague Senator Mark Wall in the Shannon through the Local Government Use of CCTV in Prosecution of Offences Bill 2021, which he brought forward last year, with a view to addressing exactly this difficulty, the difficulty local authorities have in enforcing illegal dumping. I should say that years ago, as a practitioner in criminal defence in the district court, it was always, again, quite a memorable experience to hear the local litter wardens bringing their prosecutions and describing to the court, giving evidence to the court of how they had to go through bags to pick out envelopes and to pick out materials that could identify the relevant offenders so that they could bring forward the prosecutions. It's a very cumbersome and very difficult task to prosecute in these cases. So I welcome the initiative that's been taken here. I think it's also something that has been brought to our minds more because of the pandemic-related restrictions, the travel restrictions imposed over the last couple of years has meant that many people who might have exercised within gyms or in leisure centres were instead exercising in the outdoors locally, and it really brought home to many of us the realisation that there is so much environmental vandalism caused by fly tippers and litterers in urban and rural settings alike. And it's safe to say that in some areas illegal dumping has caused really serious erosions and serious problems in different areas, and it can be found everywhere, not just in remote rural areas, but in the main streets of our cities and throughout constituencies. And cleaning up the mess comes at a cost. So it's not only creating an unsightly and in some cases hazardous environment, but Senator Wall has given me an estimate that across 31 local authorities in the state, the cost of clearing up litter and illegally dumped materials may be as much as €90 million per year, which is an enormous cost. And without considering, of course, the enormous contribution and the huge amount of voluntary effort put in by community clean-up groups who operate nationwide. And I go out with my own group, the Friends of the Grand Canal, first Saturday of every month, but I know there's also local voluntary clean-up groups across my own constituency in Portobello, in Kimmage, in Donnybrook, Terranure, Rathgar, Sandymount, Ringsend and Irishtown. And these are volunteers who go out every week, every month and do a huge amount of work keeping their areas clean. Dublin City Council and indeed local councils generally, of course, also do a great deal of work. And a number of constituents have been very concerned in my area at the removal of public bins in heavy footfall areas, such as beside Charlemont Lewis Stop, thereby contributing to a resurgence of illegal dumping and littering. And so I think we need to ensure that there's adequate supplies of litter bins, that councils are engaging in regular collection. But we also need to support local community groups, like the ones I've mentioned, that have taken such an interest and have put in such an effort to keep local areas clean. And we're very lucky that there is such a voluntary effort going on across this country with clean-ups, but it does show the need to address illegal dumping and illegal littering, and that's a really serious issue. Could I just move on, Minister, to look at the single-use items, perhaps the aspect of the bill that's been most focused upon, the reduction in single-use items, sections 11, 12, 13 and 14. And I know that we've seen some really good collaboration on waste and waste measures in the past between Labour and the Green Party. And I'm thinking of the last Dáil, when we saw a joint venture between my colleague Deputy Sean Sherlock and the now MEP Grace O'Sullivan, with whom I worked, of course, in the Shannon as well. And Sean, Deputy Sherlock and MEP O'Sullivan worked together on the prohibition of certain products containing plastic microbeads bill. And that, of course, was another important measure brought forward to address single-use items, and in particular plastic, and the enormous challenge that plastic waste constitutes. Following extensive debate and engagement with the previous government, that government agreed to pass its own legislation to ban the manufacture or placing on the market of any water-soluble personal care or cleaning product containing microplastics or microbeads. And it was the sort of engagement that led to the passage of that legislation that represents the sort of red-green or green-red politics that I believe in. But it's also a collaborative and constructive approach to politics, understanding the connectedness of the climate and biodiversity crises, and indeed the crisis and challenges in dealing with waste. So I would ask, Minister, that you might engage with your colleague in the Department of Housing to advance further regulatory measures on dealing with plastic waste in particular, both at domestic and EU level, because I think we're all conscious there's still a significant amount of microplastic material detected, specifically in marine life. And it is the logical and natural progression of banning these toxic microplastics means that we would now seek to phase out single-use usage of plastics altogether. You referred, Minister, to the levy that was imposed on plastic bags, and that was controversial when it was first introduced. And I think we often forget that because it's now become so embedded in our national culture. But the topic actually dominated phone-in talk radio shows for weeks at the time when it was sought to be introduced, as indeed did smoke-free areas and so on. And then we adjust and we move on, and we recognise the huge benefit to us all, to society and to our country, that these measures represent. And now that society is adjusted to the plastic bag levy, we all bring our own shopping bags to supermarkets without even thinking twice. So similarly, we need to move to a situation where it is a natural point that we have phased out single-use plastic. I listened to the coverage of this bill on Morning Ireland this morning, where those interviewed in Vox Pops were shocked to learn that about 200 million I'm checking the figure, 200 million disposable coffee cups are sent to landfill or incineration every year. But again, reflecting on looking at on my experience visiting the Covanta site, we saw just a huge amount of single-use coffee cups in that mountain of waste sent to be incinerated, and a huge volume of other recyclable materials there too. So while we have had very strong uptake of recycling and very positive figures on increased use of recycling and of green bins, there's still too much recyclable material going into incineration, and that is something we need to address. It is, of course, positive to see the move away from landfill, and I think you've addressed that yourself, and I've certainly seen those very impressive statistics. But we do need to do more to develop the potential in the waste-to-energy sector, for example, through the rolling out of the district heating systems, which again in my own area have been promised for a long time, the district heating measures in Ringsend, and I see you, Minister, looking somewhat rueful about this. This is something, an issue on which there's been far too much delay. We need to see this moved on as a matter of urgency. Other European countries have well-established waste-to-energy programmes, and district heating is the obvious use of waste-to-energy, obvious application where waste-to-energy can really make a huge difference, and indeed can really improve people's quality of life, and can address issues around this very concerning rises in fuel costs and rise in energy costs as well. So it's very positive, therefore, to see these measures brought in the bill around single-use items and around disposable coffee cups in particular. And I know there's been a real focus on that. Could I just speak very locally for a moment and say it's very welcome to see signs up here in the canteen in Leinster House suggesting people use their own cup rather than taking a disposable one to the coffee machine. And we do have a responsibility to lead by example. And I never miss the opportunity to say one area where we have really failed to lead by example here in Leinster House is on encouragement of cycling. And as the co-convener with Senator Garvey of the Oireachtas cyclist group, we've been pushing for many years now to try and get decent bike parking facilities in Leinster House, and it's something, Minister, that I'll be on to you again about, because we do need to be seen to encourage more Oireachtas members and staff to cycle to work, and we're not sending out a signal that we are welcoming space for cyclists with the very poor provision of bike parking facilities, with absolutely no covered bike parking facilities, and with bikes and yet cars parked everywhere, often on the lawn at the back of Leinster House as well. So this is somewhere where again we need to be leading by example, as we are on encouraging the use of keep cups or people's own cups. Could I move to another point about which I think this bill could do more, or indeed we may need to see additional legislation, and that is on the right to repair point. Because while this bill in a very welcome way will, I think, assist in shifting behaviour among producers and the general population, we do also need to do more to shift the balance of power from manufacturers and corporations and back to citizens and ordinary people. Because often it's difficult to make sustainable choices, and we heard, I think it was Deputy Kenny just speaking about the difficulties with repairing products that break down, and the fact that in too many cases those products are simply disposed of and new products are purchased. So I think this relatively new concept of a right to repair is one that we need to see enshrined in law, and it would make a huge difference in reducing waste while also addressing a power imbalance between consumers and manufacturers and putting more money in people's pockets. So in March 2020, the European Commission adopted its new Circular Economy Action Plan, which aims to establish a strong and coherent product policy framework to transform European consumption patterns to avoid the production of waste in the first place. And as part of this process, the Commission looks to embed a right to repair in EU consumer and product policies. And this sort of legislation was strongly recommended, I note, by several of the submissions to the public consultation underpinning this bill, because it is an important part of a circular economy plan. And the idea of right to repair was also echoed in debates which have taken place in the Climate Action Committee over recent months. So I think this bill could do more on this. I have already drafted a Labour Party bill to enshrine a right to repair, and I should say it was inspired by the writing of Carolyn Lillington in the Irish Times, speaking about how right to repair has really taken on a very strong force in US politics and US environmental activism, and we've seen this really coming forward. This legislation would include measures to stop waste and tackle the cost of living by requiring manufacturers, particularly of digital electronic equipment, to make available repair information to consumers and to break the monopoly on repair by the manufacturer. So the legislation is urgently needed, not just to tackle corporate power and power imbalance and to break that monopoly, but also to crack down on what we might call that planned obsolescence, that business strategy where the obsolescence of a product is built into it from its conception by the manufacturer, to the point where we all think a washing machine only should have a few years lifespan. And it's done with a view, of course, to compelling consumers, or encouraging, or I suppose creating a culture in which consumers feel compelled to continue to invest in more and more new products. So we're calling for a comprehensive right to repair to be enshrined in legislation to empower consumers and to create a market for repairable products and repair services. And I'm conscious that, like many of us, we have a number of small local phone shops in my own area in Dublin 8, where you can bring your smartphone or whatever make of phone you have. You can bring your mobile phone if the screen has cracked, and in a household with teenagers there's often many incidents of phone screens being cracked, and the small local shop will fix the phone screen usually in a matter of minutes. But of course, if that is done, generally that means the phone is no longer guaranteed by the manufacturer, because the manufacturer has retained the monopoly of repair. And that is exactly the sort of practice which right to repair legislation seeks to tackle. So I believe that should be an important component of any circular economy legislation, is to enshrine that right to repair, to re-empower consumers and to break that cycle of obsolescence which generates so much waste, and which will continue to do so unless we tackle it. So we must go beyond the current EU directives and EU measures and extend that right to include not just all digital electronic equipment, albeit that's an very important area, but also to include smaller household devices and to empower consumers generally. And in the spirit of our previous engagement with government on the CCTV issue, and indeed on the prohibition of microbeads, I would hope that, Minister, that you will work with me and with my party colleagues to see this principle placed on a legislative footing. Could I more generally just say that we very much welcome the concept of a circular economy. We have put forward in Labour the important concept that national economic planning and climate targets must be in sync, because they are two sides of the same coin, and we need to ensure that any economic strategy takes account of and builds in environmental strategy and indeed regional job generation, to ensure that we can become the renewable superpower we can be, and to break the hold of fossil fuel oligarchs and magnates. And I know that's very much in all of our minds at present. It would also ensure, of course, climate would indeed be at the heart of government. And while clearly the Green Party has a very strong commitment to climate action, the offices of an Taoiseach and the Minister for Finance and Public Expenditure are held by the other two government parties. So we do need to see that cross-party and cross-government strategising on the economy and on the environment together. Finally, I want to mention Part 5 of the bill, which of course is very important too, which will end the issuing of new licences for exploration and mining of coal, lignite and oil shale, a welcome and important component of the move to consolidate a policy of reducing reliance on fossil fuels. And again, this is a topic that many of us have been speaking about. I expressed yesterday to the Taoiseach my wish that we need to take every step to avoid the horrific war in Ukraine having the sort of consequences on climate targets and environmental action that it may well do, because we're seeing certainly this horrific war and this brutal invasion of Ukraine having enormous knock-on effects on food security, on fuel and energy security, on the cost of living for all of us across the, not just in Ireland or in Europe, but across the world, and in particular in developing countries that were so reliant on Ukrainian wheat imports, or indeed as much as anything. So we know that the war poses has already had enormous consequences. We know that it may pose a threat to the limited but hard-fought for gains achieved at COP26 last year, and it may pose obstacles to our own, to the reaching of our own climate targets. But we also know that the consequences of failing to keep global temperatures below 1.5 this century will be catastrophic, and that any further slippage could have unthinkable results for humanity as we face this existential crisis. I think all of us would be conscious of our fortune in being able to stand here in a peaceful corner of Europe to debate climate issues as the war rages in Ukraine and as people in Mariupol and Kiev and elsewhere endure horrific bombardment. But undoubtedly the climate crisis is that existential crisis that confronts us all, and that we need to take more urgent action on. So I very much welcome this bill, but I would also like to see more on the right to repair, and hope to bring forward amendments at committee stage on that topic.
John Lahart.
Actually, just in relation to the point that the previous deputy was talking about Covanta, I remember in the last Dáil as Dublin spokesperson going down to the Irish Water, the sewage treatment plant, and being told, and it's an analogy I've kept in my head since, that what flows into that in terms of sewage is the equivalent of the volume of water that flows in the River Dodder from source to sea in a 24-hour period. That's what flows into the water treatment plant, and of course it's cleansed to a certain degree and then goes out to sea. Plastic bottles, Minister, speakers have referred to it. 80% apparently of plastic bottles end up in landfills still. It takes 1,000 years for each bottle to decompose. In the United States, there's 2 million tonnes, not 2 million bottles, 2 million tonnes of plastic bottles in landfill that have been discarded. You will have heard the news yesterday that plastic particles have been found in human bloodstreams for the first time ever. Like, we have been aware of plastic particles being found in fish, and we eat those fish. The news yesterday was that a study published in the Journal of Environment International tested 22 anonymous blood samples and found plastic particles in 80% of people tested, indicating plastic particles may be able to travel around the body and lodge themselves in organs. Now, you know, this politics owes the Green Party and the Green Movement a great debt. But now, in terms of highlighting and bringing the need for climate action to the fore, and I, for one, feel comfortable saying that it is now a mainstream topic. And I think the Greens are particularly good at the legislative piece and the macro piece. But I think you're not half radical enough at all, and certainly not as radical as I would like to be in terms of the micro measures we implement on the ground. I mean, if we discover, and it is proved, that the particles, microparticles from plastic bottles are found in the human body, well, why don't we just ban them? Why can't, for example, the bottled, here's a practical solution. All the plastic bottled water on sale in our shops, why don't we encourage the water bottling companies, the big ones in Ireland, to supply substantial water fonts to these supermarkets? And let me bring along my glass bottle, or 3 glass bottles, and fill them up every time I go to shop. Why must I purchase, if I want to purchase, why must I purchase plastic all the time? This is really serious. The tax that we're bringing in on plastic cups, why not just ban them? If people want coffee, let's bring our own cups. And I think the best way to do that is ban the sale of these. And that comes to another issue. So you go into a shop, everybody buys coffee now, including myself, and it's not just the cups. You have the wooden little paddle sticks. They get used once and then they're thrown into waste. They're never recycled. Small little slim sticks. There's the coffee grains. They get thrown in the same bag as well. There are companies, fast food companies, won't name them here, who offer the coffee grains to customers free of charge. But I know from reading, yeah, great in the garden, but even that, I think there's a little bit of education needed around it, because apparently they're not great in every aspect of the garden, and they're suitable for particular plants. But with a bit of education, I just think, Minister, you know, sometimes I think we are too late, you know, and piecemeal manner of addressing this just won't work. The appetite for plastic go into your supermarket. But I think the most obscene example of where plastic is used is on our airlines. You order a cup of tea and a bun, it's a plastic cup, it's a plastic spoon, plastic sachets with your sugar, plastic holder for the milk, plastic around the bun, plastic bag to dispose of the plastic in, to be collected and disposed of in another plastic bag that the cabin crew push around. I mean, it is obscene, the amount of plastic on airlines that's peddled to consumers. I have a bill that's almost completed. It's been in gestation for quite a while, and it is around the waste recycling piece. Again, I hope to publish it after Easter. And what it proposes to do is this. It's to build on the voluntary efforts made by some of the supermarkets. I don't really want to name them, where they have large bays in the supermarkets so that people can dispose of unwanted plastic before they bring their shopping home. And some supermarkets and supermarket chains are making big leaps and big steps forward in relation to this. And I was talking to one recently of a new supermarket that opened in my area, and in fairness, they are going to great lengths to try and restrict the amount of waste. But I think we need to go a step farther. What I would like to see, and this is what my bill is intending to do, is that becomes mandatory in supermarkets and shops of a particular size. Some of the legislation around rehab and governing rehab talks about this at the moment. But that I can dispose of unwanted wrappings and container covers or whatever in the shop that I don't want. Classic example is actually in terms of paper. There's a whole load of newspaper supplements I simply don't want when I buy the newspaper, and I'd like to be able to leave them behind. But the whole idea is then that the supermarkets are just stopping at this phase, and they're clapping themselves in the back and saying, oh, we're actually enabling people to leave their wrappings behind and produce covers. But what I'd like to see is actually a message then that supermarkets can say, when we look at it actually, some packaging of some goods, customers leave that behind in much bigger volumes than packaging on other goods. And they should now be onto the manufacturer and saying, our customers don't seem to like the way you package your goods. That's the only way you'll create a chain of change. So that bill is coming forward after Easter. Yeah, the point I make again is, Minister, don't be afraid to be radical. It's a huge appetite among the public. Plastic bottles are going to kill us all. They're killing marine life and ocean life. We're digesting it. And now we've discovered there is some evidence, and I'm sure it'll just grow and grow, that we are digesting it into our system, and there's plastic in our system, and God knows what damage that's doing to us. Thanks, Ceann Comhairle.
Thank you, Deputy Lahart. Deputy Chris Andrews, please.
Ceann Comhairle. There is, Minister, some important elements to this bill which I welcome, and I suppose overall we welcome the bill, and I know that we will be putting amendments at committee stage. The provision to use CCTV in certain circumstances to catch illegal dumping is very welcome. I know that it will certainly be welcomed in many flat complexes around my constituency. Residents in the likes of Bishop Street, not too far from here, are absolutely scourged by people throwing rubbish in the bin storage areas and making them unsafe and unhealthy. And this, of course, leads to rats and seagulls, making the bin areas particularly disgusting space in many flat complexes. And these areas need to be designed and managed in a much better than they are currently. Rathmines flat bin storage area and Glover's Court bin storage area, again not too far from here, are really unhealthy and safe. And residents are afraid, in fact, at this stage to open the bin, the lid off the bin container, because they're not sure what's going to scurry out of them. So bags are not always thrown into the bin container, they're left there. And this highlights the need for the local authorities to design the bin storage areas to a much higher standard. And it was reported to me recently that a van regularly comes into the bin storage area in Markovich House, again on the other side of the city, dumping bags into the bin areas. Like vans coming in, they actually leave no or very little room for residents to dump their own rubbish safely and cleanly and effectively. So it is welcome that the CCTV and the drones will be able to be used for prosecutions, because I think that like I said, in the inner city, in the flat complexes, I think it's important, and I would hope maybe they will be able to be used. Will local authorities be able to use the CCTV in this bill? Will it make that applicable for sites like Markovich House and the flat complex? Because I think it's really important. And Deputy Lahart mentioned the excessive use of plastic packaging, and this again, like most people, I think we all wonder why so much of it is used. And I think many products are wrapped and double wrapped and triple wrapped, and this is something we all need to challenge ourselves. I know, like Deputy Lahart, I leave plastic and packaging behind, and in fairness, I think the shops that I go into and leave the packaging behind, they are very accommodating, and it is welcome that the Minister will be able to target these sort of packaging, and we need to reduce what we are sending to the incinerator, which of course is a blight on and was hoisted on the community of Ringsend. And I think that if we can reduce the packaging, the waste, reduce what's going to incinerate, that would be a good piece of legislation.
Thank you, Deputy Andrews. Deputy Jennifer Whitmore, please.
Very much, Karen Corla. I welcome this discussion today on the Circular Economy Bill, which we reported on at a pre-leg scrutiny at the Joint Committee on Environment and Climate Action in June of last year, and a report subsequently published in December. We met with many stakeholders who provided evidence from a broad perspective, including the Department itself, Voice Ireland, European Environmental Bureau and Circulaire. The backdrop to this new proposed policy is part of the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act 2021, which outlines Ireland's transition to net zero and achieving a climate neutral economy no later than 2050. It also puts on a statutory footing the Circular Economy Strategy, the Circular Economy Programme and the National Food Loss Prevention Roadmap, which will focus on reducing food waste by 50% by 2030. We currently live in a linear economy where raw materials are collected, often to the detriment of developing nations, then transformed into products that are used until they are finally discarded as waste. Value is created in this economic system by producing and selling as many products as possible. That leads to the take, make, dispose consumerist culture we all partake in. And I must say, the statement that was made by Deputy O'Rourke in relation to it being a backward-facing policy as opposed to a forward-facing, I think it's absolutely correct. This is how we used to live, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I think we need to reflect on the values that we had in those days and probably learn a lot from many people who still practice that more frugal lifestyle. Two Environmental Protection Agency reports last year pointed to a worrying trend in relation to the way we are dealing with our waste. The first, released in September 2021, showed 69% of Ireland's plastic waste is burned instead of being recycled, sending additional greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. A second EPA waste report published in December found that while waste was rising to record levels, recycling was falling, and that Ireland was over-reliant on incineration to tackle our waste. Furthermore, in 2019, almost half of our rubbish was burned, and that was up from just 4% in 2009. The EPA said at the time that systemic change is needed to shift the focus to designing out waste and promoting reuse and recycling. And I'm hopeful that in this bill that we will see the shift that we need to help us reach our emissions reduction targets, but also help us move towards a more sustainable and fair economic system. In a circular economy, waste is minimised. Products are kept in use for as long as possible through design, repair and reuse. And when a product has reached the end of its life, its parts are used again and again to create further useful products, hence the circular nature of resources and products as a result. This bill will hopefully be a turning point away from a linear economy towards a circular one. It intends to put Ireland on a path towards a circular economy by placing the Circular Economy Strategy, the Environment Fund and Programme and the National Food Waste Prevention Roadmap on a statutory footing, and will also introduce levies and bans on certain single-use items while using CCTV to deter dumping and littering. What I would like to focus on in relation to this bill are the changes made since it was scrutinised during the pre-leg at the Joint Committee on Climate Action, of which I'm a member. And I also want to briefly touch on timelines and targets. But most importantly, I want to spend most of my time here today discussing the need to poverty and disability proof this and other climate action policies. And I think that's a key focus and should be a key focus of government in bills and policies of this type. The bill has marginally improved from the pre-leg stage, incorporating some of the recommendations of the Climate Action Committee, and I know that you will be discussing this in your closing statements as well, Minister. These improvements include some definitions as the meaning of the circular economy, which identify each stage of the supply chain and the need to minimise the harmful impact each stage has on the environment. Clarifying the term recovery activities does not include incineration, which is also welcome. And it is welcome that the annual reporting process under the Circular Economy Plan will now be done in tandem with the Climate Action Plan and will be done through a statutory instrument. I also welcome clarification from the Department that the existing list of environmental levies is indicative and that it can be extended to include single-use items such as wet wipes, hotel toiletries, sugar and condiments. However, it has been highlighted by the Department that this bill only deals with food packaging and other items will have to be dealt with separately both within the Department and within the EU. Furthermore, a significant public awareness campaign will be implemented on the foot of the enactment of this bill, which is welcome, and that was another key recommendation of the committee. Unfortunately, there are some shortcomings in the bill. A lot of our recommendations have been deferred for consideration by the Circular Economy Interdepartmental Committee, which is to be established after the bill is enacted. These include measures such as VAT relief for refurbished and repaired items, insurance and liability for those working in the repair and reuse sector, harmonisation of civic amenity sites with co-location and cooperatives such as men's sheds, challenges of planning obsolescence, the renewal and wider development of traditional and heritage crafts, skills and practices, and measures on the construction sector could take to reduce waste. With regards to the last point, there is a hesitance from the Department to increase costs on quarries to incentivise the recovery and recycling of construction industry waste, as this could increase construction costs. In addition to those limitations, I also have some concerns in relation to the language that's used throughout the bill. There are many locations where the word may is used instead of shall regarding the Minister's powers to impose levies, bans and regulations. The bill does not specify where funding from the levies will go to the Environmental Fund, and I will be seeking to amend this bill at later stages to strengthen the language so that this piece of legislation is robust with the full backing of the law. And this was an issue with the climate amendment when it first came through as well, is that sort of looseness of language. It actually doesn't bring the clarity and the strength that a piece of legislation requires, and I would like to see that worked on in relation to this. A key criticism of the heads of bill was the lack of any concrete timelines or targets, and I have to acknowledge that the bill has improved in this area. For instance, there is now a time frame for the circular economy strategy to be completed within 6 months from the commencement of the first strategy, and not less than once every 3 years after that. And the government has indicated it believes that a 6-year time frame is appropriate for the circular economy programme. The committee also requests that numerical targets for sectors to move towards the circular economy be included in the final text of the bill, and I'm happy to see that that was provided for in section 7.6. These targets will now be included in the circular economy strategy as provided for in legislation. Now, while these improvements are welcome, a lot of these proposals are to be etched out in the circular economy strategy itself. And this means that much of the targets, reporting and target ranges will not be in primary legislation, which means they will not have the full backing of the law. And it could compromise our ability to ensure that sectors are held to account and do in fact adhere to government strategy in this regard. Overall, there is much improvement that can be carried out to make this an integral part of our climate action objectives and to help us achieve our national and international objectives. I will seek to put forward amendments to that effect when the bill comes back for committee and report stages. But I do want to get to the important issue of poverty proofing, and in recommendation number 62, the Joint Committee on Climate Action suggested that consideration should be given to environmental and human rights considerations in devising circular economy action plans. And I believe that this applies to both the international and the domestic context. Internationally, the success of the circular economy in developing countries will be critical to global efforts to ensure sustainable growth and our collective climate action goals. Human rights, economic inclusion and social equity must play a central role within circular initiatives both at home and abroad. Domestically, we need to ensure that the rights of those who are on low or fixed incomes to participate fully in economic life are protected, enhanced and enforced in a new circular economy model. Hence, poverty and disability proofing should be an integral pillar in the development of a circular economy. What is being proposed here today, which if implemented, would bring positive change for our environment and help us to reach our climate action goals. But we do need to make sure that this new model does not negatively impact on those on low or fixed incomes or people with disabilities. As we transition to a zero carbon economy, we must ensure we leave no one behind and that the transition is fair and a just one. What NGOs have persistently advocated for when we make that transition to a zero carbon economy is that people on low incomes must be able to afford their minimum energy needs. In the context of a circular economy, we also need to ensure that the same is applied to food and essential goods and services. And that is why I'm calling for this bill and the circular economy strategy to be poverty and disability proofed. So what does this mean exactly? Poverty proofing is the process by which government departments, local authorities and state agencies assess policies and programmes at design and review stages in relation to the likely impact that they will have or have had on poverty and on inequalities which are likely to lead to poverty, with a view to poverty reduction. In the context of rising energy costs and inflation, we need to be cognizant of the real daily struggles of people we are dealing with. And I'm sure every member in this Dáil has had people in contact with us who are really struggling at the moment with the cost of living, the cost of fuel, costs that they could have actually managed last year or the year before, but with both the global and domestic situations, that they are finding it very difficult at the moment. I had one constituent who was on to me. He's a cancer patient who had to give up work, and he's now on disability payment. He received a large electricity bill, and in order to pay for that bill, he ended up not having enough money to pay for food. Now, this man also has type 1 diabetes, and he ended up in hospital after going a hypoglycemic attack as a result of unstable blood sugars. That is the situation that many people are facing. And as I said, this is a constituent of mine who was in contact with my office. So this is the reality facing people at the moment, unable to pay their heating bills, resorting to eating less or eating cheaper, less nutritious foods. Their children bear the brunt of this upheaval, and with inflation continuing to rise, so will poverty rates. Poverty and disability proofing government policies will be more important than ever. And we can do this in a number of ways. For example, on page 10, section 7, subsection 5, there's a list of strategies and national plans which the circular economy strategy must have regard to. However, there is no reference to poverty reduction strategies including the forthcoming strategy to combat energy poverty. And I do hope that the government can actually include a reference to those strategies in that section once it's published. However, we are at an impasse in relation to crucial policies that will affect people with disabilities and people on low and fixed incomes now. Ireland still has no relative poverty target. The government's roadmap for social inclusion 2020 to 2025 does state a key aim to reduce the level of consistent poverty to 2% or less, with an associated goal to reduce child poverty in Ireland and to ensure that all families have the opportunity to participate fully in society. We're also waiting on the review to be completed on the National Disability Inclusion Strategy 2017 to 2021, which should feed into this legislation and into the Circular Economy Strategy. While the new strategy is not ready for inclusion in this piece of legislation, there may be room to include the current one, even though it's out of date. The Europe 2020 strategy set an EU poverty target to reduce poverty by at least 20 million people by 2020. The poverty target was crucial, keeping poverty high on the EU agenda. However, it failed to reduce poverty by more than 8 million, following an increase to 123 million during the 2008 crisis. While the Commission is currently considering proposals for an EU poverty target for the next decade, we still need to reference the existing target in legislation. Section 7 of the bill does include a reference to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. However, the EU is only on track to meet 26 or 15% of the 169 targets in relation to those goals, which is obviously very concerning. So in the meantime, while we wait for ongoing developments in national poverty and disability strategies, we could include in the current bill consideration of the Roadmap for Social Inclusion 2020 to 2025, which does include poverty targets. This is currently a live document, and it will help assess the circular economy strategy against the targets in this roadmap. I was concerned there was a policy that was launched there by the Minister a number of years ago. It was actually the waste prevention strategy, and there had been no consultation with organisations that deal or support those at risk of or living in poverty, and there was no consultation with disability groups who deal with people on the ground in relation to the drafting of that. There's 36 groups that were consulted on that document, and it ranged broadly from the Restaurants Association to Ireland to the Soil Recovery Association, but unfortunately there was a major gap when it came to those living with disabilities or at risk of poverty. And I think this is something that we absolutely need to keep a focus on. I do also want to touch on the fact that this bill the measures, or what I'm talking about at the moment, it's not just about poverty proofing, that a circular economy bill should also play a role in alleviating poverty by addressing the structural inequalities inherent in a linear economic model. The aim should be to support social enterprises in Ireland that provide support and employment for those living in poverty, making sure that they're more involved in the circular economy, and ensuring that circular economy products are cheaper than existing products, which would have a positive impact on those on low incomes. So there is huge potential in this bill, if it's gotten right. And I know Oxfam Ireland have done a lot of work on the poverty alleviation mechanisms within a circular economy, and I would recommend that the Minister perhaps meet with them. You may have already had those discussions in relation to that. This is very relevant, as currently products that are currently on the market aimed at reducing waste are really out of reach for most people. So at the moment what we see is, and it's great that we are seeing, you know, zero waste shops, but they tend to be a lot more expensive. And so I think there needs to be a focus on government to support these and make it the norm and not the sort of novelty measures. During the transition, we need to ensure the cost is not prohibitive for people on low incomes, while at the same time investing in sectors to create sustainable employment that is accessible to all. In relation to the Environment Fund, which has already been set up to collect the plastic bag levies, this could be expanded in terms of which groups it can fund using the revenue generated from further levies as part of the circular economy section strategy. In Section 8, there is a list of sectors that can apply for funding. However, it is short on any reference to organisations that aim to reduce energy poverty, the impacts that the circular economy could have on people living with disability or illness, such as the man who came to me with cancer, as I mentioned earlier. So I think, you know, if we're talking about poverty proofing and ensuring that there's a fair and just transition and using this circular economy bill to focus on those people, I think that there should be groups that they should be included in the groups that could benefit from the levies, to make sure that these payments are being directed back to the right areas and to the right people. People who are at risk of poverty or with disabilities, they need to be treated as active participants in the new economy, not relegated to inactive as they currently are in the linear economic model that we live in today. I would also like to recommend that the Circular Economy Interdepartmental Committee, referred to by the Government as the group that will look into some of our committee's recommendations further, that group also include the Minister of State for Disability as well as the Minister for Children and Justice to cover the the poverty portfolios. Okay, so without proper consultation on our climate action policies, we risk accelerating poverty and further disadvantaging people with disabilities. And while there will be an opportunity to engage later in the process at the legislative stage, it is also important that their voices and concerns feed into policy process at the initial stages. Consultation should be active and it should be early and thorough to make people feel that they've been involved and to give us the best possible result. A review clause will be crucial to include in this bill, and I hope to bring this as an amendment as the legislation progresses through the House. This would include a review to be carried out in conjunction with poverty and disability advocacy groups to see how the bill has impacted on those with lower fixed incomes, and to assess whether the drafting of the circular economy strategy, the levies applied and the National Food Waste Programme have taken into account the needs of those most vulnerable to transition and change. I think that would be a key thing to monitor the progress of this bill and the impact of it. In terms of food poverty, we need to be cognizant of affordability in the context of the rising cost of living. I understand that there is an opportunity to address pricing of food products in the Agriculture and Food Supply Chain Bill, which will establish a new authority called the National Food Ombudsman to enforce unfair trading practices directive and to have a specific role in analysing and reporting on price and market data in Ireland. We can use this as another tool to help address food poverty, and I want to call on various ministers to ensure advocacy groups are adequately consulted in this piece and the full range, on this piece in particular, and the full range of climate action policies in the future. The idea of a circular economy, I think in the current economic context, is a positive one. But we also need to be cognizant and very focused on how our new economy will treat people, and particularly those people who are most vulnerable in our society, and whether we include them or view them as passive actors during the course of this transition. We have an opportunity to change this by adopting a more holistic transitional approach for people in poverty or with a disability, and to recognise the opportunity to drive social change alongside climate change and climate action. And I think, you know, as I sort of do more work in this area and get older and have, I suppose, a more holistic view across society, my focus, which had already and originally would have been very much environmentally focused. I mean, that was my background, that was my area. I'm now starting to see that we cannot separate environment out of how we live. We cannot separate it out of every single element so that it impacts on people. So whether it's food costs, whether it's fuel costs, whether it's travel, it impacts. It has to be. It's so cross-cutting. And our responses and the bills and the policies that we develop have to take into account all those other sectors as well. We can't just look at it as an environmental bill. This will, cut plastic out of our environment. Therefore, we won't have plastics in our water. It cannot just be seen as that. We need to look at it that's required. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Whitmore. Deputy Cathal Crowe, please.
Thank you, Minister. I welcome the discussion we're having here tonight on the Circular Economy Bill. I think this flips on its head the whole idea of take, make and waste. There's huge waste in this country day in, day out, and small changes, and some of the changes that are being proposed in this bill could see an annual saving of 2.3 billion if people just change the way that they function. And I've been listening, just before I came into the chamber, they've been talking about this new motorway from Cork to Limerick, and that money would build most of that motorway and probably a bit extra as well. So that just puts perspective on the waste annually of some of these, some of the bad environmental habits as a society we've come to accept as norms. There was just a few things I wish to comment on. Look, obviously the idea of disposable coffee mugs and cups is a very good thing, and the sanctions are being brought in that regard, along the lines of the plastic bag levy brought in the late 1990s with huge success. But I think our takeaways, every town and village has its takeaway, and there are a lot of foil trays, plastic tubs that come out of these takeaways. Yes, you can recycle them at home if you're willing to throw them into the sink and scrub them down and into the bin and dry them. Most people fling them straight into the bin, and far too often these tubs get chucked out the window of a car at the local beauty spot that someone has stopped off to have their picnic on the way home from the chipper, and this is happening far too often. So I think there are elements that legislation needs to go after as well. It's not just all plastic bags and coffee mugs. There are other forms of proliferation of littering that I think we need to tackle as well. Really enthused to see this finally deal with CCTV and its use in terms of combating illegal dumping. Sections 20 to 23 of the legislation tackle that whole area of GDPR, and it allows people to start using cameras in a really smart way to detect illegal littering and to secure prosecution. That's the only way we're really going to get to a head on this. I'm chairman of a local environmental group, the Woodcock Hill Enhancement Committee, and for the last 2 years we've been told repeatedly by legal professionals, by Clare County Council, that you can't use cameras. I've gone to local Garda Síochána members, senior members, and I said, look, if we detect an act of littering, if we detect a crime, and if we pass this over to you, are you going to refuse it? No way, they said. They said, we'll take it into a court and we will gladly test that legally. There has been no test case of this. I believe this GDPR barrier that time and time again we're being told is prohibiting us from using CCTV. I don't believe it exists in real terms. This is some fandangled idea that I think legal experts have drawn up, because I'm repeatedly told by people in the legal profession in Garda Síochána they will not turn away CCTV footage if it's presented to them and of high quality. We've seen in the realm of criminal law in recent years where CCTV camera footage is welcomed with open arms in our court system. And I'm not convinced that it has been a barrier in the last 2 or 3 years. We seem to have an interpretation of GDPR in Ireland that's not fully congruent with other European nations, and I don't get that. The other thing, on a slight tangent on GDPR, all the regulations relating to hedge cutting, I've seen each and every summer as I go abroad to continental Europe, they're also governed by the same environmental legislation as us, coming from the European Union. They seem to be able to cut hedgerows, we can't. They seem to be able to use CCTV cameras, we can't. I think sometimes there is a skewed interpretation in the houses of the Oireachtas and in body legal, in body politic, that we can't sometimes take very sensible regulation from Europe and implement it in a more simpler way. So I'm glad, because we were facing the prospect of going into court and trying to prove this in a test case, I'm glad that can now be done. I just want to tell you what we use in the Woodcock Hill Enhancement Committee. We use a trail camera purchased in Lidl. I think it was €80 it cost us. It has a little battery pack in the back. We strap it onto a tree. We know where the litter is always dumped. The batteries last for 3 or 4 months, and there's a little SIM card in it. So when a car passes up and when the boot pops open, I get a little message with the photo, with the video footage, and I can see who's dumping, and sometimes it's very interesting. Sometimes it's the people you would last expect to be doing so. I'd love to abuse all privilege and name them all out. I won't, Count Corla. I don't want to raise blood pressure here tonight, but it's very interesting who's dumping. We like to profile them in our head and say you know, it's that guy or that woman. It's not. It's often very surprising. It's very often the person down the road holding down a top career that's chucking stuff out of the boot on a Monday morning on their way to work. They probably know who they are if they're watching here tonight. You don't always need to use Dáil privilege. Sometimes what's unsaid is understood in the home environment. Other forms of enforcement, I think, also need to be looked at. We have in County Clare, I think we've 3 litter enforcement officers, but we've 800 council staff. Now, I'm not diminishing all of their roles. They all do important jobs. Some of the jobs I know what they do, and other jobs I don't know what they do. But there's 800 people working for Clare County Council, 3 of them working in the domain of litter enforcement and waste enforcement. That's wrong. They're under capacity. They do a fantastic job. But by God, how can you tackle a problem when you're that under-resourced? There's other areas of pollution they can't go next or near, like noise pollution and air pollution. On the 22nd of January, Minister, Ennis Town, with a population of 25,000 people, had air quality on that day worse than Beijing, a city with 21 million people. So that says a lot, and there's no capacity to go after that. It just gets a headline, it gets mentioned on Clare FM and the Clare Champion, and there's no great follow-up because we don't have the capacity to enforce noise, air and all the other forms of pollution. We seem to be good at tackling litter waste because it's seen, you take it away, it's dealt with, but we don't have a capacity sufficient yet in Ireland to deal with that. Wheelie bins, I just checked before we came here to the Chamber, €306 is what a national wheelie bin provider is quoting for a 12-month contract. Surely, in the year 2022, we could make wheelie bins mandatory. There are a lot of people bringing out the little bag and burning it in the back garden by night so the smoke isn't seen in the dark. There's people stuffing it into bins as they walk down the street. Surely we can do that. We're charging people a lot of money on USC, local property tax. Surely a little bit could be given back to people. Bins in train stations. I took the train this morning up here. Limerick train station. You can recycle and waste side by side. You come up to Dublin, having had your sandwich and your bottle of Ballygowan, and there's no bins, and when you do find them, it's waste only. Simple thing, but they should be side by side wherever we go. And very finally, naming and shaming. When I began as a councillor, I think a lot of us served in local authority, the council agenda booklet, the back pages were always printed in pink, and we all flicked them because it listed everyone convicted for a litter fine. And that disappeared in the last few years because GDPR said we couldn't do it. That's codswallop. I think we can. I think we need to get back to doing it. There's nothing like peer enforcement and seeing that Mary and Joe down the road dumped litter out of their car on Saturday and were fined €150. It's great. It teaches them a lesson they'll never forget. I think we need to get back to publishing that and let newspapers have their field day. This should be a little thing on page 2, page 3 of the Clare Champion every week. Let's name and shame them. I think legislation can do that, Minister. Thank you very much.
Deputy Brian Stanley, please.
This piece of legislation is long overdue, Minister. I brought forward a bill in the previous Dáil in relation to return and reuse of waste. I think that it's important that we have fairness in a just transition, and that needs to be at the heart of climate action. So, you know, citizens need to play their part. We must also get big business and large multinationals, they need to do their bit also. We have to move away from the one-use, throwaway culture and single-use plastic. Of course, we want people to change their habits and to use less plastic. But large companies, you know, continue to package stuff, and I'm sure you see it in supermarkets. You go in to buy something and it's in plastic trays. We need to ban them. We don't need plastic trays anymore. We know that, you know. You can do the weekly shopping without bringing home 10 or 15 of these plastic trays that all have to be disposed of. And if recycled, they'll wind up in India in a furnace or somewhere, you know, or in China, having to be shipped halfway around the world. We need to stop it at source. Reuse is okay, but it's only second best. Cutting off the source of the waste needs to be the primary thing. And we need to move away from a situation where we have that in supermarkets. There's also a cost to the packaging, and that cost is passed on to the customer. That cost is passed on to citizens. If you're buying vegetables and in plastic wrappers, somebody's paying for them. You can be sure that that's added on to the price you're paying at purchase. So we need to stop it, cut it at source. We also need to use our semi-state companies. These need to be at the heart of this, Minister. And I'm appealing to you as a Dublin TD to just look out at this, because Portimona are already involved in recycling and in the circular economy. They're operating major waste facility plants, you know, they have such as tyres in one, waste collection in another, and you know they have really geared up in this. But what we need to do is you know, we need to utilise them in such a way that we're not reinventing the wheel. So individual action by companies, cutting it off at source. I welcome the return, the circular economy, but if we can cut off the waste at source, is better. I want to very much welcome the CCTV. This is an issue that I've raised many times, and I concur with previous speakers. It's a pain in the head, right? The fact that we can't use it. In Laois, they were using it very effectively. Small cameras strapped to a bush or a tree. People were getting caught with it. GDPR has gone crazy. We need to stop it. I don't know where the interpretation of that comes from, but I believe that we're overusing GDPR, or it's being used as an excuse sometimes. We need to use that and be able to, and I would ask you to bring forward a bill quickly so as we can accelerate this to get CCTVs back in action, mobile ones at black spots. We also need to watch that wherever we do, that doesn't put people further into poverty, and want to make sure that we are rewarding particularly low and middle income households. And we can do that by some of the things that I just mentioned, deposit return. And let's move to glass bottles. That page is A4, right? So why can't we have standard bottles? Standard bottles. You'll remember this, I remember it, where they can be washed and reused and reused and reused. So people get a return on them. Let's get away from plastic. Let's take plastic out of society as much as we can and try and reward people for good environmental habits.
Thank you very much, Deputy Stanley. Now we go to people before profit. Deputy Breed Smith, sharing with Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Yes, I am indeed. Gormagut, Ceann Corla. 317,000. That's the number of tonnes of plastic generated in Ireland in 2020. And 93,000, that's the number of tonnes of that plastic that was recycled, less than 30%. So, as somebody who really cares about the environment and recognises that of all the marine litter in the European Union, 70% of it is represented by only 10 of the most commonly found single-use plastic items. So I can really appreciate where this bill is coming from. In fact, the last time that we took action on banning plastics about a year ago, it was to ban all plastic cutlery. Voila, Exhibit A. That little fork is sold in this house along with fruit, and it's a plastic fork. And I thought we had banned them. And I think there's a lot of stuff goes under the radar. Now, I'm not the big police chief of plastic, but I am passionately concerned that we produce way too much of it, we use way too much of it, and that this bill, although it's very welcome, and it was welcomed with great excitement in my party when we thought, oh great, a circular economy bill, let's have a good look at this and see what it'll do in terms of the environment. It does not tackle the real polluters, the fossil fuel industry, the plastic industries, those that make and produce the plastics and make the most profits from them. And I think that's a real shame, Minister. I think it's a real shame, and it's a habit that the Green Party in particular are in danger of repeating. Aside from the interlinked issue of the climate crisis, I can think of no more important issue that we could deal with. And it goes to the heart of dealing with our environmental crisis, but also with how we deal with the planet's finite resources. They are finite and they're being exploited and overused in a massive way. And the way we produce and constantly produce and reproduce and push economies all the time to have more and more products is not sustainable. It is simply not sustainable. And because it is the very basis of the system, the capitalist system under which we live, we're going to have to think about that and think about ways of challenging that system. And that's why I think it's really important that in a modern capitalist society, where there's exploitation, overfishing, exploitation of marine life, depletion of natural resources, depletion of natural minerals, overuse of fresh water, disruption to the global hydrological cycle, burning regardless of the consequences of carbon and fossil fuels, the destruction of rare earth minerals, the destruction of forestry and so on. We do need a strong, robust bill that addresses all of that. It would, in fact, a bill of that nature would tackle the planned obsolescence inherent in much of the world's global production and supply networks. It would fund and enshrine the right to repair and ban the use of damaging chemicals in production. And it would support locally grown and healthy food production. And it would regulate and use bans and restrictions on how our finite resources are ultimately being exploited. And to do that in a concrete way, to even begin the process to build or aspire to a genuine circular economy, is in fact to challenge the very basis of production under the sort of capitalist economy which we have. Because the whole basis of production in that economy is the unrestrained use of our natural resources with no regards to the natural limits, no regards to the consequences of that production or the commodification of every possible resource like water, clean air, decent food, things that are essential for life. Externalities is a phrase used by economists to categorise the costs and the damage done by this model of production. The pollution, the despoliation, the overuse and the depletion of natural gifts. But this is not, in fact, an unfortunate aside or an unforeseen consequence. They are essentially and at the heart of how production for profit takes place. If externalities were truly costed and paid for by the oil, gas and plastics and petrochemical industries, all those industries would be bankrupted by now. The system effectively privatises profit and socialises environmental destruction. So the idea of a circular economy is absolutely at the centre of any sane response to the multiple environmental crises that we face. But as with every policy that seeks to address a crisis or an aspect of capitalism, it's often mangled from the original concept of the system itself to being co-opted into the idea of extracting maximum financial reward from any product, any activity or any resource, from the core idea of an economy moving away from the model of take, make, throw away towards the idea of create more, repair more, reuse more and carefully use the gifts that nature has benefited all of society with and not for the profit of a tiny minority. Move away from a system based, as Rachel Carson says, on the gods of profit and production. And so our problem with this bill is that it doesn't deliver on its goal. No one bill or one piece of legislation can, because it would challenge the very fabric of capitalist production. The bill doesn't really have an aspiration at all in that direction. In the 93 sections that the bill has, what consumes the largest space? Is it banning single-use plastics like the fork I just used in Exhibit A? Or is it fining producers or covering a greater range of products that those producers will be held responsible for at the end of the life of those products? Is it banning harmful chemicals that are used in creating packaging, banning pesticides? Perhaps start looking at how the privatisation of waste management has actually damaged the goals of reducing waste and safeguarding the environment. No, the largest block of this bill is concerned with the use of CCTV cameras by local authorities and recordings made by mobile phones by officials. Now, I note the frustration of all the deputies who have been local authority councillors and who have expressed that frustration here today. And while I really do understand the issue of legal dumping and fly tipping is a big, big problem. So, for example, Dublin City Council spends €1 million a year on average cleaning up just on the streets for the fly tipping that happens, while the companies that were privatised and make vast profits from bin charges contribute absolutely nothing to the project of dealing with the fly tipping. And fly tipping, a lot of it happens because people cannot afford ever-increasing costs on bin charges, particularly in poorer communities. But to be honest with you, CCTV is all over my estate, for example, but nobody looks at it. Nobody looks at it because the staffing levels in the council are cut back, the staffing levels in the Garda station are otherwise affected. Nobody watches the CCTV coverage. Now, I don't know about rural Clare or East Galway, but certainly in big cities like Dublin, I imagine it's the same in Limerick, Cork, Waterford, etc. Nobody in the local authorities actually watches this stuff. And the chunk of the bill that is concerned with this is actually very worrying. I think it's disturbing, to say the least. We face widespread pollution from industrial sources that are damaging our rivers and our urban and rural areas. We have crises in water quality and water management. We have a boom in mining activities that is triggered by a rush for certain scarce and rare minerals, with the fears of long-term damage to our river and water courses. And so the campaign against mining in Ireland have given out statistics here that the global gold industry has been a driver for a mining rush in Ireland, to the extent that Ireland North and South has been identified as a hotspot for the European mining boom. And today, 27% of the south of Ireland and 25% of the north of Ireland has been concessioned for mineral prospecting licences. And most of it is in areas like the Sperrins in County Tyrone, Derry, Donegal and Connemara, rural communities in Wicklow, all being affected. In some of our most beautiful areas of pristine beauty, we have issued hundreds of licences for mining to Canadian and other global corporations. So these things conflict with each other. Producing a bill on the circular economy and doling out licences for mining in various, to that extent, all over the country is actually a conflict of interest. I'm struck, however, by the similarity with the Climate Action Bill. Again, a much anticipated piece of legislation that did attempt to address a key environmental crisis, but a bill which suffered from vague language and multiple get-out clauses in addressing that crisis. And so in this bill, we see the repeated use of the word may. We made this, we made that. There's a lot of strategies, a lot of plans, roadmaps to be constructed at a later stage, and actually very little use of the state's ability to regulate and ban harmful activities. While on one level, we welcome the efforts to address the single-use plastic, it has to be said that the time taken and the various loopholes that allow for continued production in the coming years, continued production of said plastic, is very worrying. It's been pretty clear that alternatives in almost all of the products discussed here are possible, aside from a relatively small need in medical and some specialised cases. From the position that we know that we have now, our marine environment is drowning in plastic. 70% of all marine litter, as I said earlier on, comes from the 10 most commonly found single-use plastics. In Ireland, we produce up to 80% more plastic packaging per head than the rest of Europe, and where we generate 27% more municipal waste than the European average. We should have seen stronger and more robust timelines and actions. So, yes, we welcome the banning of some of the single-use plastics, but the timelines here for banning are worrying, and of course we can bring amendments to the table and move instead to bring them forward. But the charge for disposable cups is not what is needed given the scale of the crisis. It smacks a bit of the carbon tax, that you punish the behaviour of people rather than that of the corporations and the producers of the waste. The lack of definite targets, I note the version of the Minister where it says, again, where it says may introduce targets in the future and introduce targets for a waste management plan, but it would be preferable to have seen those targets here. Again, we will try to amend it in that way. Until we see a circular economy strategy, a circular economy programme, or the food waste prevention strategy, it's hard, if not impossible, to know how seriously to take this bill. In short, I welcome that it does mention the circular economy, but puzzled by the fact that it seems to attach such little of that economy in the here and now. I am alarmed, however, at the future plan to deal with food waste as one of the key policy having regard to Food Vision 2030, a policy that has correctly been labelled by farmers who are interested in sustainability as an expansion plan for Ireland to become a world leader in sustainable greenwashing, heavy on spin while thrashing the Paris Treaty obligation, a policy which embeds the model of dairy expansion and creating more markets abroad should not be mentioned in the same breath as the idea of food waste prevention, or indeed in the same breath as the idea of a circular economy bill. I also fail to see how the Circular Economy Bill can be serious if it doesn't seek to address the disaster of municipal waste management. And just to return to it again, the privatisation of municipal waste has been a disaster for workers, for the environment, for the householders, and I would ultimately argue for the local authorities themselves, who, like I said, are picking up the pieces and picking up the tab for the private companies, all of whom are registered offshore, by the way, and make vast profits, while their costs to the ordinary household goes up and up and up, and the fly tipping increases all the time. Lastly, I want to comment on what is heralded as a key element, which is the extra charge on disposable cups of between 20 cents and €1. Again, it speaks to the common theme of how the Green Party in particular addresses environmental prices. As I say, a miniature version of the carbon tax, a policy based on the idea of changing the behaviour of people, but allowing multiple loopholes and get-out clauses for corporate and systemic products under certain circumstances, corporate and systemic nature of the problem. So we can keep manufacturing these things under certain circumstances, but we'll charge people for using them. If we drown in a sea of plastic, if we choke all the species in the marine environment, we are dragging our feet on the banning of the manufacture of such damaging products. What timelines stretch to 2030, given the scale of the crisis now? I know we are to expect a deposit and return systems on bottles later in the year, but this should also be in the legislation. I believe, Minister, the mistaken belief here is that the environmental crisis can be tackled by neoliberal measures which charge our behaviour out of existence, but only if it could happen and only if it's aimed at individuals. Never aim it at business, at corporate entities that ultimately benefit from the production and the manufacturing involved.
Thank you, Deputy Boyd-Barrett.
Yeah, I learned a couple of things when I was in Palestine. I was about 18. One, I learned that Israel was an apartheid state and that we need to do something about that. But while I was there, I was working in the desert, and we were growing tomatoes and melons, all sorts. But one of the interesting things, and it's always stuck with me, is when the farmers were producing the tomatoes for the European export market, each morning we'd bring massive bags of chemicals and pour them into these big vats. Because they were being exported, you needed chemicals to keep them solid, so that they could be transported huge distances to Europe and would still look good at the other end. And then you had the nice tomatoes, beautiful tomatoes, where no chemicals went into them, which were produced for the local market. And they were absolutely gorgeous. They didn't look exactly the same as the ones you get when you go to the shelves here, but they were the tasty ones. And there was no chemicals in them at all. I should say, I learned something else. The rotten melons produced by this Israeli farm were sent to Gaza. I learned that as well. But there's a very important lesson in that little experience, and it relates to the discussion myself and Breed had with farmers the other day, where they, and it's been highlighted by the Ukraine crisis, we were feeding the world, and then we discovered actually when the Ukraine crisis comes, we're not actually feeding the world. We grow a lot of cows, and we export them, and we export a lot of dairy-related products, but actually we could be in danger of not being able to feed ourselves, or even be able to feed the cows, because we don't grow enough grain, and don't grow enough food and vegetables, and so on, right? And the fact that we import these things and they're transported all across the world means more chemicals, more plastic, more fumes being exhumed and so on, more waste, more destruction of the environment, rather than diversifying agriculture here to produce stuff locally, so you don't need loads of chemicals, you don't need loads of plastic, you don't need loads of packaging, and so on, right? So diversifying agriculture would give us food security, it would reduce waste, it would give actually a more certain existence for farmers and so on, but we'd have to support our farmers in doing it. So I just say that as one important point. And that, you see, is the logic of the way neoliberal capitalism operates. And I know people don't like it when you use these slogans, but that is the truth, right? The way capitalism operates, it specialises in the production of cheap products on massive scales for exports to the market, not for production for need at a localised level. And the consequences are disastrous for the environment. I'll give you another simple example. When I was young, probably when the Count was young as well, you used to get the milk delivered by the milkman. And it was in glass bottles. And you left the empty bottles out every day, and those bottles were reused and reused and reused and reused and reused. When I worked in the Netherlands, they used to do the same with beer bottles. So when you bought your Heineken or your Amstel, you had to bring it back to the shop where you bought it, and then you buy more, and you got money back when you brought it back, and they were using the bottles again and again and again and again. Right? And then what happened? We got Tetra Pak. Massive amounts of cartons, which is complete waste of resources. Why? Because somebody was able to make money out of it. And it was because it was all about the commodification of these things rather than actually doing things in a rational way. Last point I just want to make is, listen, it's all very well talking about the circular economy. By the way, I'm for it. I'm just stressing that we're letting loose the forces that are destroying the circular economy. The last point is, you have to give local authorities the staffing, the resources and the infrastructure in order to have it. And OCN knows this from our area. We don't have anything near like the staff in the cleansing department. You have to fight to get a bin, a massive fight to get a bin anywhere. And we don't have anything like the resources necessary in the local authorities to provide the recycling, reuse, so on that we would need to have a meaningful circular economy.
Thank you very much. We move on to Deputy Margaret Catholic, sharing with Deputy Brian Ledden.
I attended a We All Alliance event at the weekend, and a comment was made by Dr. Peter Doran at Queen's University Belfast that it stuck with me. Since he said the most successful ideologies are invisible. And I think sometimes when our friends across the House are successful, they're successful in making visible the ideology that's often invisible to us, which is the neo-capitalist model. And I think you're absolutely on the money in that. That's all right. I'll send you some membership forms over as well. We can the transfer season might be open soon. I think this circular economy bill does move in the right direction. It does contain measures which moves us to away from that make waste, which is, I think, following a slavish idea of GDP and of economic throughput as being the good that we always chase after, and it's moving us to a more circular economy model. I think this will fit well with the move that we're doing in terms of well-being budgeting. I think the two things will sit well together, and hopefully we'll begin to move away from a slavish pursuit of just GDP growth. I think it's welcome as well that we have alignment with the rest of the EU today, because the EU Commission today announced the Circular Economy Action Plan, which proposes new regulations to make almost all physical goods more sustainable and energy efficient throughout their life cycle. And the regulations will impact all aspects of that life cycle through design, usage, repurposing and disposal of products. So I think we're seeing, I suppose, two facets of government in the national level and at the European level beginning to work together to move us somewhat in the right direction. One thing that, and I'd echo the comments of Deputy Stanley, one thing that I particularly welcome is that local authorities are going to be empowered to use the
GDPR compliant technologies such as CCTV and drones to detect and prevent unsightly and illegal dumping and littering. And I will disagree with Deputy Smith on this point. It is used in Waterford, or was rather, and was used extremely effectively. We have many extremely scenic areas which are unfortunately blighted with illegal and fly tipping. But in 2020, Waterford City and County Council was officially reprimanded by the Data Protection Commissioner for its use of CCTV, one of 7 local authorities to be so reprimanded. And it does make a big difference. There are areas of the county that are difficult for local authority council to get across, and the CCTV and the drone technology was being used very effectively in order to fight the fly tipping. So I do welcome this, that in section 14A and in the new section 14B, that we will now be allowing for mobile recording device for preventing, investigating, detecting and prosecuting offences under the 1996 Act. I think it's timely. I think it's a step in the right direction. It's only a small measure within what's a larger bill, but I do think it'll make a difference to people on the ground. There are other measures in this bill that I think are extremely welcome and over time, and I commend the Minister for bringing to the House.
Deputy Ledden.
Caramagat Ceann Corla, and I welcome the bill, and I'd like to commend Minister Smith and the Department officials for the work they've done on it. And the Joint Oireachtas Committee for Environment and Climate Action that I chair was tasked with the pre-legislative scrutiny of the bill. I see Deputy O'Rourke and Deputy Smith are members of the committee, are present, and they worked during that pre-legislative scrutiny as I did and as Deputy Whitmore, who spoke earlier, did. I commend them for their efforts. And I want to commend my colleague, Deputy Richard Bruton. We appointed him as a rapporteur on this issue, and he compiled an extensive report to the committee, and his efforts do underpin that pre-legislative scrutiny report, which we published in the autumn. In that report, we put forward 62 recommendations to strengthen the bill, and I wish to note that the provisions of the bill do bring very positive developments. However, I do have some concerns whether the language of some of the bill is strong enough to ensure the legislation works in the long term and not just in the short and medium term. Colleagues across the House in this debate have noted the current global economy is based on a linear model of production and consumption, a model that is economically and environmentally unsustainable. Global demand for raw materials for things like food, electrical goods and clothes is increasing sharply, and it is clear perhaps now more than ever that we need to find smarter and more efficient ways of using those raw materials. In the last 2 years, we have faced a global pandemic and, as its consequence, a public health crisis. As life finally started to return back to normal, Vladimir Putin's cowardly invasion of Ukraine caused unimaginable suffering for the people of Ukraine and instigated further crises in Europe and the world. The current security, energy and humanitarian crisis and the emerging food crisis are not isolated events. They are intrinsically intertwined, and following a 2-year pandemic, they create a perfect storm that neither our energy dependence on fossil fuels nor the linear model of production and consumption can successfully address and overcome. And I've spoken about the security and energy crisis several times in this House before, and today I want to touch on the food crisis that could affect millions of people. Even before Putin started a war in Ukraine, the global food system was strained. Food systems cannot be resilient to crises if they are not sustainable, and just as with fast fashion, fast food is another extreme example of unsustainable practice that drives the take, make, waste model. And while I might disagree with my colleagues across the House on many issues, I agree with Deputy Boyd Barrett in some of his comments a short time ago. The globalisation and commodification of the food market has given us huge problems and challenges. One of those challenges is that it has made food cheaper, and because prices are low, consumers consider the products to be disposable. But growing, processing and transporting food uses a significant amount of resources, and for all food that is wasted, the resources that were used to produce it, deliver it and cook it are wasted too. In 2019, Ireland generated just over 1 million tonnes of food waste, and that represents a carbon footprint as high as 3.6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. and cutting waste in half by 2030, in line with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, will support the transition to more sustainable food systems, as well as contribute to the reduction in emissions. However, I note with some regret that the specific waste reduction targets are not included in the bill. I do commend the Minister and the Department officials on the work to date in addressing the challenges and providing a legislative framework for the circular economy, and I look forward to engaging with the Minister and at the committee stage, and I hope he will be in a position to accept amendments.
Thank you, Deputy Patricia Ryan.
Minister, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this bill. Many of the measures are long overdue, and in general Sinn Féin will support the bill. We will engage and bring forward amendments where appropriate at committee stage. This bill will have far-reaching consequences and a much greater effect than the blunt instrument of carbon taxes that this government is heaping on ordinary workers and families. Minister, in just over a month's time, on May the 1st, your government will add fuel to the fire and will punish those who can't afford to change their behaviour in relation to climate change mitigation. Many of my constituencies would love to install solar panels and other renewable technology, but they simply can't afford it. The bill provides for councils to use CCTV and to try prevent illegal dumping, with a code of practice for their use to be drawn up. It will also allow councils to use drones and other mobile recording devices to try and prevent illegal dumping. It is important that the protection is extended to the community CCTV, which is in legal limbo currently. Every summer in particular, the rural roads of Kildare and Laois become a nighttime dumping ground. This is partly as a result of this government and the last one abdicating their responsibilities and allowing the effective privatisation of our domestic waste collection services. We need to bring back domestic waste services back into public responsibility. Councils are struggling to provide mattress recycling days in some municipal districts, and they must be properly resourced. We've all seen the video of the mattress dumping in rural County Offaly. It is only the tip of the iceberg to what we have in Kildare. And some would say it's no wonder when we have the Department of Defence getting away scot-free by dumping God knows what while filling in the hollow next to Donnelly's Hollow on the Curragh. There was a cover-up that day and there's more since, Minister. And further waste of taxpayers' money. The Department gave Kildare County Council a choice between mediation or taking the Department of Defence to court. The taxpayer was left with a mediation bill of over €22,000 at the end of the process and a veil of secrecy which nobody, and not even the Minister, will lift. This bill will not facilitate the introduction of a deposit and return scheme, which you know is long overdue. Nor does it introduce the long-promised feed-in tariff to allow households and businesses to sell electricity back to the grid. We are told that, I suppose like Christmases, they are coming. This government needs to act on these vital measures. Time is running out for our planet, and it's definitely running out for you if you don't do something soon. Thank
you, Deputy Ryan. Now, Deputy Matt Shanahan, please.
Corla. Minister, your Circular Economy, Waste Management and Minerals Development Bill, you've said it's designed to create more sustainable patterns of production and consumption that will minimise waste to significantly reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And in a circular economy, you say waste and resource use are minimised. The use and value of products and materials is maintained for as long as possible. When a product has reached the end of its life, its parts are used again and again to create further useful products instead of being discarded, which is an all too familiar pattern now. Your Bill, Minister, seeks to incentivise the use of reusable and recyclable alternatives rather than the range of wasteful, single-use, disposable packaging and other items. And I know today, Minister, the Government has announced already a tariff on disposable coffee cups, which I welcome, but I'd ask you, what about plastic bottles? And behavioural change is required, Minister, in terms of what you're trying to adopt. In the United States, as far as I know, there's still a return fee on aluminium cans. Is this something that Ireland can do regarding plastic containers such as shampoo and bathroom products? I'm not sure, Minister, have you spent any time in the supermarket aisles of late in the, I suppose, at the personal hygiene section, but you'd be appalled at the amount of plastic that resides there, single-use and otherwise, and the idea that a lot of it is being recycled is a complete misnomer. I think you're probably also young enough or old enough to remember the idea of replaceable razor blades. But this is going to require consumer change, and something has to be done to get people back to make a preference to use and reuse and recycle. And in terms of single-use plastics, Minister, I'm sure you're aware that there is no viable recyclable of single-use plastic. It either goes into landfill or else it is burned in incineration. And I would ask, has anyone in your department looked at the increased quantity now of single-use plastics in food packaging, styrofoam trays that are being used for meat sales products, and as I said, shampoo and soap products. So we need to incentivise alternative packaging, Minister, in terms of cellulose packaging, Tetra Paks, glass instead of plastics. But how is this change and this price differential to be achieved? And I think your bill needs to spend some time considering that, Minister. In terms of the food waste, we produce and import significant volumes of food and fruit into this country every year that never finds its way into consumers' fridges. We employ best before dates to ensure food integrity, but oftentimes there is significant disparity between best before and what is actually out of date. Much of this food waste ends up as organic waste, and in some cases it can be used as animal feeds. But much of it could be used in biological digestive systems for energy production, Minister. But we haven't got our act together yet in this country to try and incentivise that activity or get any production from it. And are you aware also, Minister, that it is producers who suffer the cost of this food waste and not the supermarkets or the retailers? I believe if you want to tackle the issue of food waste at supermarket sectors, you need to look at the practices that supermarkets employ in terms of purchasing, minimum supply quantities, and when unsold, they are left at the producer's expense. You mentioned the Circular Economic Fund within your bill, Minister, and this is building on the objectives, you say, of the Environment Fund. You are proposing that this fund be developed through this bill, the aim being to fund key environmental projects in the coming years. Lofty aspirations, Minister, I would say, because I would like to ask you a question. How are these environmental projects to be evaluated and assessed into the future? I have worked with many companies over past years in the food sector who are looking at developing significant innovation in terms of manufacture, packaging, increased shelf life, etc. And I can say in nearly all cases, the state resourcing and access to state resourcing was almost negligible to support that activity. It is my experience, Minister, that we really do have a great record in transformational innovation in this country unless it comes from the university sector, and we largely tend to ignore it when it comes from the commercial sector. So, as I say, lofty ambitions, Minister, but ring-fencing money for use in R&D that is not properly spent is just another form of taxation, Minister. So I will be interested to see your proposals in respect of the circular economy as the legislation moves on. The amendments to the Waste Management Act's fly tipping and dumping has already been mentioned by a number of deputies here tonight, and it is a scourge and a blight on our rural environment in particular. As a councillor, I was engaged with Waterford environmental teams in the disgusting activity of going through domestic waste bags dumped at the roadside to look for evidence that would pinpoint who was responsible. I was amazed even then with the evidence in terms of receipts and correspondence found, the difficulty there was in pursuing any prosecution. In Waterford Council, a number of times I asked for CCTV to be deployed at a number of problem dumping spots, but was informed by the Executive this was not possible because of GDPR issues. When I tried to set up a private group conducting video monitoring, I was also told that I was in danger of ending up in the courts because of data legislation. So I note, Minister, in your bill you suggest that number plate recognition or facial recognition is not to be used in this video data. So I wait to hear your thoughts on what evidence you can bring to bear in terms of video analysis without some recognition of vehicle identity that is going to result in prosecutions for fly tipping and serial dumping. I welcome your proposals to incentivise the better segregation of waste streams for the commercial sector, leading to greater waste being diverted into recycling or organic bins. But much of this waste, Minister, may have a compostable agricultural product opportunity, and this is an area I think the Department needs to look seriously at. Organic waste can be a significant alternative to fertiliser products in agriculture, and at the moment we know the problems we are having internationally in terms of sourcing and paying for fertilisers. So, Minister, I would ask that your department do significant work on this, please. I welcome the ban on the exploration of certain fossil fuels, the mining of coal, the lignite and oil shale. I think that is progressive. In summation, Minister, I think there is a lot in the bill to be welcomed, although it has to be said much of it is aspirational at this time. It is also true that many of the objectives, particularly in terms of consumer behaviour, will require a significant degree of cultural shift. There will also likely be additional costs in terms of the supply chain to be borne, and this will affect the end price, Minister. How is this to be managed in terms of competing imported products? One thing is certain, it will be difficult to change consumer behaviour without some cost-benefit recognition on the part of consumers. And this will not happen, Minister, without significant re-education and reinforcement of both the environmental damages that are being caused by our present consumption patterns and the possible environmental benefits that can accrue if we adopt a new reuse recycle policy. In that, your bill sets out a roadmap for the future circular economy. I welcome it, Minister. Although, like many, I fear its publication may be a great deal easier to complete rather than the practice it wishes us to change. I would therefore ask you, Minister, that you in your department engage early, often and repeatedly with manufacturing, with trade and with retail sectors, so that this policy objectives you desire in this bill may be mutually agreed and therefore may possibly be implemented in the future.
Thank you, Deputy Shannon. Now we go to Deputy Paul McAuliffe.
Minister, I want to welcome the publication and the progress of the Circular Economy Bill, and I think it's another step forward in this government taking actions which I regard as climate brave. And I'll come back to that point of both politicians and voters being brave on climate action, because I think without us taking those difficult decisions and incentivising, and in some cases de-incentivising different measures, we will not solve the climate crisis, and we won't do what's required to address this planet being on fire. And we know that we can reduce our use on fossil fuels, and that is absolutely required and needed. But the transition away from fossil fuels will only address 55% of emissions. The remaining 45% comes from the things that we make. And so we need to end our culture of making and wasting, which is many of the values that previous generations in Ireland implemented without a circular economy bill, and instead we need to adopt a more circular economy focused use on reuse. There are different ways that we can do that, and we know that individual consumer choices are key, but it will never achieve the type of change that we need. And so I welcome some of the system change that is so crucial in addressing climate action. And communities will be so important in addressing this issue. And I want to give credit here to, I suppose, two people who have educated me on the issue, two organisations. One is Dublin City Council, our own local authority, who do huge work educating, first of all, our climate ambassadors, our tidy towns groups that are out in every community in the city. But also, and I know, Minister, you've made a visit to this facility, the National Rediscovery Centre in Ballymun, and I would encourage any school student in the country to make contact, or your teachers to make contact with the National Rediscovery Centre in Ballymun, an old heating facility that was used to heat the Ballymun flats that are now demolished. With use of European Union money and lots of renewable technology, we've been able to repurpose that as a showcase for renewable use and for rediscovery. So my open call to the school children of Ireland: come to Ballymun and come and discover what you can do with the circular economy, because those institutions are taught me about this issue, and I suppose in some ways educated and encouraged me to be brave on this. So yes, this will involve additional costs on consumers. A levy is an additional cost on consumers. We have to be honest about that. And like other environmental taxes, we're making things more expensive to use that are bad for our community, for our country and for our planet. And we don't want to collect these taxes. We want people to switch away from them. But in order to do that, we need to increase the cost of some of these items. And that is a difficult decision, particularly in the context of a cost of living increase. And we're also putting in place alternatives, and I think that transition towards those terms needs to be at least ambitious, Minister, as the financial instruments that are so easy to implement. We know the transition is much more difficult and takes more time, but we need to be at least ambitious on those alternative options, because we can't penalise people and not provide the alternatives. But yes, when we take climate action, it involves opportunities, but it also involves unpopular decisions, and it involves what I call being climate brave. Like the addition of cycle lanes and bus lanes, which take away road space from cars, we need to be honest with people that what we're doing there is actively discouraging and discommoding drivers in order that we can make the change to save our planet. That's what we're doing, and we should be honest with people. Of course we know that not everybody can cycle. Of course we know that public transport is less convenient than the mobile heated armchair that many of our cars have become. But we're doing it not to discommode or to attack drivers. We're doing it because we know that that is what we need to do in order to tackle the climate crisis. Like densities in homes, we have to be honest with people that building more dense communities may mean that we have less traditional homes with front and back gardens. But why are we doing it? We're doing it because we need to create more sustainable communities. And yes, on carbon tax, we're increasing the cost of carbon fuels because we want to create a fund that will create a just transition, that will protect those on low incomes, and a fund to do that, and that will fund retrofitting to end our dependence on fossil fuels. And all these measures require brave decisions by politicians, climate brave decisions. They require politicians that are willing to take those brave decisions, often unpopular, and it requires voters out there to reward politicians that are climate brave, that are going to take those difficult decisions. I've seen too often in here members of this House lurch towards the easy answers, to the less brave decisions, to the populist options, and that might get you re-elected, but it won't save the planet. And I would say to people, remember the politicians that introduced the smoky coal ban, who introduced the plastic bag levies, who banned smoking to improve air quality in public buildings. History looks more favourably on those people who are brave. And I would ask that we say to voters out there, look at those politicians that are being climate brave and reward them. Now, on the details of the bill, in particular, I want to point out sections 11, 12 and 13 around a levy, and sections 14 that will allow a prohibition. And I think, Minister, if the levy doesn't work, we have to move quickly towards a prohibition. We already have regulations on the deposit and return scheme, if I'm correct, last year, and I know a number of member oppositions obviously weren't looking at the regulations that were issued last year. We need to move quickly on getting that implemented. Hundreds of people attend football matches, and unfortunately there are bottles and cans left behind. Football clubs in my area have often said they'd love to collect those cans and use them as a revenue source, and make sure that those materials are stored away safely. I have to turn in the last minute to the issue of CCTV, Minister. I think my community, more than any, is scourged by illegal dumping, and it's done because of people within my own community, within our own community, engaging in it. The CCTV measures here, I think, get us back to a point where it's legally possible to use CCTV, but CCTV will not be the solution to illegal dumping. We have to go further. We have to give local authorities more nominated officers to issue fines and to equip them. We are way behind in what we can do to tackle illegal dumping, but I absolutely welcome the measures in this bill, and I think we should look at Senator Malcolm Byrne's bill on the issue of CCTV and emerging drone technologies, for example, to address it. Minister, a lot of good work done in this bill, and I would encourage you to keep going.
Thank you, Deputy McAuliffe, and I think our last contribution to this evening on this will be from Deputy Martin Brown.
Ceann Comhairle. For those that don't know, I live in Cashel, County Kerry, a town with an amazing heritage and an amazing location and amazing people. I was involved in a zero waste pilot programme from 2017 to July 2018. Its aim was to reduce waste by 25% through a number of different initiatives involving the community. It had a particular focus on ending the bad habit of seeing products as single use when alternatives could be found, or indeed those products could be repaired or recycled and become use again. This ranged from waste reduction, workshops and repair, reuse of products, upcycling and so on. There was huge interest and buy-in from the local community, and it really showed us what could be done if we all adopt measures that promote sustainability. There is public appetite for this, especially given the money-saving nature of it, which can't be overstated. This is particularly relevant to what we are talking about today, adopting measures that develop the so-called circular economy, which involves a move away from single-use disposable items to advocating a more sustainable way of manufacturing and consumption. This can be done through manufacturers adopting production methods that not only ensure they cut down on non-biodegradable packaging such as plastics, but also ensure that the product itself is non-perishable, can be repaired if worn or broken and reused. We need to throw off the mindset of single-use items. That is why the inclusion of this bill of measures to deal with single-use cups and containers is needed. And when talking about this, we must point out that the raw material resources which we use per year is already 50% more than nature can replenish in a year. And this will rise to a factor of 3 by 2050 on present trends. This is the definition of unsustainable, and this is where the circular economy needs to be reinforced through investment in alternatives. We also need to ensure that methods that are adopted to deal with the scourge of littering are realistic. Using technology to monitor dumping is one thing, but it means nothing if that technology is not used when dumping is proven to take place. We cannot confine this type of monitoring to a 9 to 5 working hours, because if we don't target at the time when people are proven to dump rubbish, then not only are we wasting money and resources, we'd also be doing the campaign against littering a disservice by throwing it into disrepute, by making it seem to be another waste of public money that is not able to target the scourge of dumping properly. So if we really mean what we say, then we cannot do it without the system having real teeth in terms of being able to tackle dumping effectively. We support this bill and will bring forward amendments at committee stages where we see fit.